So welcome to chapter 48. It's on ecosystems, and in this particular flipped presentation is only the first part of the chapter. Ecosystems. What are ecosystems? Well, ecosystems are all the biotic, remember that means living, and abiotic, the non-living factors of a community, including energy flow and chemical cycling. So when we talk about trophic levels, what we're really saying is what level or feeding level is that particular individual in. For instance, we have our first level here, which are generally our producers. They are autotrophs. They convert sunlight or chemicals, that could be chemotrophs, into energy, which is then transferred to the next group of organisms, which would be your consumers. Generally we call those the primary consumers, and then of course we have another set, our secondary consumers, that will then transfer the energy from the giraffes to the lions. So like I had already mentioned, we have our primary producers, which are our autotrophs, which are photosynthesizers. And then I already discussed a little bit about chemotrophs, which are generally bacteria, and what they do is they use hydrogen sulfide as an inorganic, remember inorganic meaning it doesn't have carbon and hydrogen, as a food source. And we can see that those wonderful colors in the lake here. It's probably at Yosemite where the bacteria are growing and converting sulfur into energy. So the other trophic levels are the heterotrophs, which means other feeders. And when we talk about the heterotrophs, so they're obtaining energy from another organism, we have our first level, which is our primary consumer. And then we have, like I had mentioned earlier, our secondary consumer, which generally it's the primary consumer. And then at the top of our trophic level, we have our tertiary consumer. So we can see here we have our dandelion, which is our producer, and then the snail is obtaining the energies flowing from the dandelion into the snail. And then the energy is going from the snail to the little bird, and then the little bird gets eaten by the big bird. So we can see how energy flows through the organisms in this particular ecosystem. So the last level we're going to talk about in this scheme of energy conversion from basically our producers to our top carnivores is that energy then gets locked up in those organisms, and eventually they need to be replaced into the ecosystem, and that job is done by our detrivores. And detrivores generally will break down, like I said, any kind of dead organic material, but not just the dead organism itself. It will help to break down the feces or fallen leaves. We also refer to these organisms, one of my favorite words to say is our saprophytes. So those particular organisms would include bacteria, which we have here, our fungus, which is a mushroom, and then we also have some other invertebrates here, some worms, and it looks like a slug or something over here. So in this diagram, we can kind of see that energy flow from starting with our sunlight here. That solar energy gets converted by the producers, and then of course the consumers are going to eat the producers. In this particular picture, we're also showing other particular nutrients like oxygen being produced by the producers and taken in through cellular respiration, converted back to carbon dioxide, which is then used by the producers to make more sugar. Of course, when all of these groups die, then the decomposers will come into the picture and then be used either as nutrients for the producers, which then get converted to food for the consumer. So everything we can see in this trophic level energy flow diagram, how everything is related and important. All organisms are equally important in this diagram. So food chains, I think we all can understand pretty easily without a whole lot of discussion what food chains are. And again, that's a transfer of energy through the different organisms. You know, big fish eats little fish. We can see that by the diagram here. So I have two different food chains here. I have a terrestrial and then a marine. So in the terrestrial, we've already seen another plant here. Whoops. Our plant, the energy is transferred to the herbivore, the grasshopper. The grasshopper gets eaten by the mouse gets eaten by a snake, and then the snake gets eaten by a hawk. So we can see that that energy that started down here eventually ends up here. Now, to look at the marine food chain, because many of you guys being in McHenry, Illinois are not familiar with a marine food chain. Let's start here with phytoplankton. Now, phytoplankton, and we're going to learn about that a little bit later this semester. Those are your plant-like plankton. So they photosynthesize. So there's your primary producers. They are then going to be eaten by the zooplankton, which means they're like an animal-like plankton. They are heterotrophs. And then they get eaten by the little fish, and the little fish get eaten by the bigger fish, and then the big fish gets eaten by the orca up here, other words known as killer whale or the top carnivore. So again, we can see how the sunlight, which is important in both of these food chains, go here, start off here, and that energy gets transferred all the way through that food chain. Now, food chain is it's a linear relationship. Now, we know that in ecosystems, it's not quite this linear, and that's where we're going to go to our next topic, which is a food web. So here is our food web. Now, food web is made up of at least 3 food chains. We can follow the energy. Remember, the arrows are not showing who is eating who. It is showing how or which direction or where the energy is going to. So in this particular, let's start with a rabbit. So we have our primary producers, the grass. The energy from the grass is going to the rabbit. The energy from the rabbit isn't going to the fox, or it could go to the hawk and owls. If we go here, the squirrel eats the grass, so the energy from the grass going to the squirrel, which again can go to the fox or the owl. Let's go over here. Over here we have the grass, again, is the primary producer. It is being eaten by the herbivorous insect, which then gets eaten by a predatory insect, which then gets eaten by a toad, and then the energy ends up in the snake. So you can see all these different pathways. Oh, this one's really good. Here, let's go from the grass to the herbivorous insect to the predator. And then we have an insectivorous bird, and then that bird gets all the way over here to the fox. So we see how they're all related to one another. So here's a marine food web. So again, we have down here, we have our phytoplankton, our primary producers, and then they are going to be eaten by our consumers, which we're going to do our zooplankton. So our zooplankton right here. And then it's going to then be eaten by the little fish, and then the little fish goes to the squid, and the squid goes to the big fish, and then to the shark. Or we can go over here from a diatom to a plankton-eating fish, and then that fish will go to the squid, and the squid could then go back up to the big fish, to the tuna. Or we could go to here from the dinoplankton to the copepods to the herring, and then all the way up to our top dog here, which would be that shark. So you can see how these individuals are related to one another. So once the energy has gone from the producers, so we've incorporated that energy into materials into the body, so we've incorporated that into the organism, the actual producers, is then transferred to the consumers. We need to be able to get that energy back and those materials back by decomposition, so the breakdown of organic materials. And this is what's going to connect all those other levels. It recycles organic matter. Most of the decomposers are prokaryotes or fungi. So again, when we look at the energy in our biosphere, it does start from the sun. So photosynthesis sets the energy budget. Only a small amount of energy is captured from the sun. We're talking about 1 to 2% of energy of energy output from the sun. It produces 170 billion tons of biomass, which is organic material per year. Our primary productivity is based on the amount of light that's converted to chemical energies by autotrophs in a given time period. So let's talk about biomass. Biomass is the weight of vegetation, or dry weight. Dry weight because water has no caloric value. It has no energy. And what we're talking about is energy being transferred through that ecosystem. When we talk about primary productivity, that's the rate in which new biomass is produced. Forests have a high standing crop biomass, meaning there's a lot of biomass there, but its productivity rate is low, so it's not producing additional biomass. Versus a tropical rainforest and grasslands and estuaries, they're very productive. So they're constantly making new materials because they have the environment which allows them to do that. So primary productivity, continuing this, terrestrial plants' productivity, the things that affect whether they can produce more biomass is light, precipitation, and temperature. And we've studied how precipitation is water, how we need that in order for photosynthesis to produce energy for that plant to grow. We know that productivity is greater by the equator. If you think about the equator, there's plenty of sunlight available to drive photosynthesis. Things that limit productivity would be nutrients like nitrogen, phosphate, and carbon dioxide. Now, in an aqueous environment, so when we talk about water, we have this thing called upwelling, and upwelling is going to bring some of those nutrients that have fallen down, so your decomposing materials, your fish that died or whatnot, that contain that nitrogen, phosphate, and other resources, that they fall to the bottom, they would get trapped down in this bottom layer of the marine environment. So upwelling in the marine habitat will help to bring those materials up where our plants are going to be, right? Because our plants, our primary producers, will be up at the top soaking up the sunlight, so they need those nutrients to be brought kind of like to them, which these upwellings, these you could say currents, will help to provide those nutrients. When we talk about secondary productivity, when we go from our primary level to our secondary, we know that there's going to be an energy loss due to that transfer of energy. We've talked about energy conversions and entropy, and how we lose energy, or in the form of heat or just in entropy when we talked about the second law of thermodynamics. So we know that we can't transfer energy without some kind of loss. So some of the things that energy is used for, and if you think about it, the food that you take in, when we take in energy and by eating, our body's going to be using that food in order for providing energy in order for cellular respiration. We talked how it takes some energy to get glycolysis started. We end up with more than when we had to invest, but we do need that initial investment. Your body growing, developing, replacing tissues. And of course, there are some materials that are not used, and so are then excreted from the body in the forms of urine or fecal matter. So all of the food that we take in, all of the resources that we take in, they are used to maintain our body. So we're losing energy in just transferring that to the next trophic level. So, of course, we can't really think of ourselves as being consumed by another organism because we're the top carnivore. But if you think about that mice eat a lot of food in order to sustain their metabolic rate. And so all that food that they have used in order to maintain their body temperature, even, it has been lost to the environment. It's not all going to be converted into resources that can be used by the next level, trophic level, that snake. So that brings us to what is called ecological pyramids. Now, in ecological pyramids, these are going to reflect the efficiency and how we transfer that energy from level to level. Now, we know that we only transfer about 5 to 20% of the total energy between levels. So each level, we're going to lose 80 to 95% of that energy just in the transfer from going from one trophic level to the next. All right, so we look at ecological pyramids. Here's an example of one. Remember, we're losing about 90% of energy for each trophic level. Now, because we are losing so much energy level between trophic levels, this really does limit us to the number of individuals we can have in a single food chain. So I'm going to work on this one. I'm going to kind of go in a backwards direction. So humans here, we're the top carnivore. Now, our tuna fish sandwich is going to have approximately 100 grams. 100 grams of tuna fish. Now, for each, we're going to get 100 grams of tuna fish for each kilogram of tuna. Now, that tuna has to eat approximately 10 kilograms of mid-sized fish. All right? So the mid-sized fish are going to eat approximately 100 kilograms of our small fish. Now, our small fish are going to need to consume 1,000 kilograms of the small zooplankton. And then from our zooplankton, they need to consume about 10,000 kilograms of our primary producers. So we need 10,000 kilograms of our primary producers in order to support our tuna fish so that we can have a tuna fish sandwich for lunch. Now, we can also have an ecological pyramid using biomass, and again, that's the weight of the standing crop, the dry weight at each level. Now, here I'm going to show you the just another pyramid here, a food pyramid, so we can see how we go down about 10%. So only 10%, I should say, is transferred to each level. So we start with our grass to grasshoppers, to these little secondary consumers, looks like a muskrat or something, and then those are going to be eaten by the hawk or the owl. It's an owl up here. Now, sometimes we can have an upside down pyramid. Now, this can happen if, for instance, you have like an oak tree. An oak tree is huge, but it can support many, many, many insects feeding on them. So again, this usually happens when your primary producers are really, really big. Sometimes in an aquatic ecosystem, we can also have an upside down pyramid because phytoplankton is consumed very quickly. They also reproduce quickly. So when we look at biomass numbers, and this is what we're looking at here, is the actual biomass available. So we have a lot more biomass up here in the carnivores than we do down here in the producers. So this ends the first part of chapter 48. Almost forgot there. Chapter 48. Hopefully I will be able to get the second part up quickly. And you can work on that Monday night after you take your test on Monday.